Hello, everybody. Welcome to Inside Israel. It is Monday, December 16th of 2024. Really appreciate you being here tonight. A little bit of a different format this evening. I'm going to start, first of all, with a bit of front matter, just some things that I want to address before we actually get into the content. This episode is not going to drop on Wednesday on Apple and Spotify. This is one of those weeks where we are running an interview instead. I did an interview recently with Amanda Borschel-Dan. She's the host of The Daily Briefing, which is the Times of Israel's daily podcast, and which is now the number one English language news podcast about Israel in the world. It was picking up a lot of steam during 2023 when people were out in the streets protesting judicial reform. And people were turning into Amanda every day to hear the latest scoop on Israel. And then obviously since last October, it's become even more popular. So I sat down with Amanda and asked her, how does it feel to be really the voice of Israeli news for so many around the globe? Why she moved to Israel in the first place. She's from North America. She has, I can't remember from the interview, 8 children, 10 children, a few of whom are in the army at this time. Very, very idealistic. We talked about Hebrew words as well. So this Wednesday, that episode is going to drop on Apple and Spotify. It will not be on my website. So if you want to listen to that, it's got to be right there. Second thing is that if you live in New York, the tri-state area, and you were thinking of coming to Christmas Eve for the Jews, that's December 24th at 5:30 p.m. for the doors, 7 p.m. show at City Winery in Manhattan. There are 21 tickets left. So get moving on that because there really are very few tickets left at this point for Christmas Eve for the Jews. And again, that's just citywinery.com or put in City Winery NYC, Google that, and Christmas Eve for the Jews, and that'll come up. Okay. Tonight, I mostly want to address your questions. I think we've gone 3 weeks without my being able to take questions. We ran an interview. Last week was a really in-depth look at Lebanon, which a lot of people wrote me saying they enjoyed, and I'm glad. But it was so in-depth and long that we simply ran out of time for questions at the end. We were over an hour last week. So what I really want to do this week is go through some of the questions that you've been emailing in. Before I do that, I want to talk about 3 news stories. And my goal here is really to give you an insight into how Israelis are thinking. And so there are 3 news stories that stood out to me that might shed a little bit of a new point of view on the Israeli mindset by looking at them. And the first one is sadly what happened today in Madison, Wisconsin. As you may have heard, there was a school shooting in Madison. This was at a private Christian school. The latest number I heard was 3 people dead, including the attacker. But that number, I've seen different reports, 5, 4. What matters, we know for sure 1 student was killed and 1 teacher was killed. So why am I bringing this up on a podcast called Inside Israel? This is one of those episodes that Israelis often talk about when conversation comes up about whether they should leave Israel and live somewhere else. Since October 7th especially, Israelis will say, maybe I should just move to America. I don't know, I have a family member who's American. They could help me get a visa. But often what will come around is, are you sure you'd be safer there? Have you heard about the school shootings? I mean, school shootings is one of those violent acts that really does make it into the news in Israel and that Israelis are aware of. And I just heard this today. This is the 83rd school shooting in America this year, including college campuses, elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. And I don't know if the saddest part of that story is that we've already hit 83, which is the highest number we've ever had, and the year isn't even over. Or is it sadder that I haven't heard of most of those? And probably most of us cannot remember hearing about 82 other school shootings. It has become so common and so ubiquitous here in America that it doesn't even make the news when there's a school shooting. And Israelis will bring this up in conversation. They'll say, with everything going on here in Israel, you're not necessarily safer in America. You can send your kids to school, and God forbid there would be a shooting. And there is this feeling that in Israel, at least we're a little bit aware of who our enemies are and we can take precautions. Whereas here, I think in America, there's this sense of the randomness of the violence, that something supposedly innocent, like going to a sporting contest. You know, there was a big shooting in Vegas recently, I think before some sort of sporting event, and going to school. These can be considered dangerous activities, or certainly not harmless activities in America, and that enters the conversation in Israel. So I thought that would show you a little bit about where Israelis stand on that. Number two big story is, you're always curious, like, what are Israelis talking about right now? Israelis are really fed up with the shenanigans going on in our government. Israel is trying to pass a budget. The Knesset is trying to pass our budget for the upcoming year. And there are some right-wing members of the coalition who are refusing to pass the budget unless the attorney general is fired. Now, why would they want the attorney general fired? Because she is holding up judicial reform. She's also prosecuting Netanyahu. And so Itamar Ben-Gvir is threatening to leave the coalition. And he said today, I think he posted on Facebook or somewhere else, that he's serious, that this is not just some bogus red line that he is, drawing in the sand that he wouldn't actually stand up to. He said that either the attorney general is going to crumble the government or I will topple the government by not joining it. So if the attorney general is not fired, he says that he's going to leave the government. Now, the other really well-known right-wing politician, Bezalel Smotrich, he actually did something which I kind of commend. He said that we need to table judicial reform discussions until after the war in Gaza, after the war in Lebanon, those are wrapped up, and after we have a budget. And I think that's more the prudent thing to do. Look, I personally am against judicial reform in general, but if there is going to be a discussion, it certainly has to be after everything happening right now. But the bigger takeaway is that Israelis are really, really fed up with all this government nitpicking and shenanigans and threatening to leave the government when we have hostages in Gaza still over 430 days at this point. We have soldiers in Lebanon and Gaza even now. And there's this feeling that our government, our politicians are much more concerned with themselves and their own seats than they are for the well-being of the country. So that's the number two real takeaway, is that just how fed up Israelis are with the balagan, as we say in slang Hebrew. And number three is there's a lot of talk in the headlines about quote unquote being closer than ever to a hostage deal. And I got to tell you, I have said this pretty much since the beginning. I will believe it when I see it. I, for one, do not believe that this so-called hostage deal that we're really, really close to, I don't believe it's actually going to come to fruition. Certainly not before January 1. I just, I I think it would have happened until now. I don't think that the situation now is so much different in terms of what the various sides are asking for, in terms of what they want to happen. Certainly, you have to understand the political calculation on Israel's side. Netanyahu's coalition is very fragile. As I just mentioned, it might fall if Ben-Gvir decides to leave the government over the attorney general. And another reason it could fall is that these right-wing politicians, in particular, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they want Israel to resettle Gaza once again. Their dream is what we call, the greater Israel, Eretz Yisrael, the whole Israel, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, and that this is an opportunity to settle Gaza. And what Hamas is saying is that the IDF needs to be out of Gaza, or at least have a framework for being completely out of Gaza, if they are going to agree to a hostage deal. So for Netanyahu to agree to a hostage deal, he would essentially have to be saying, I am giving up on resettling Gaza. And that would mean the end of his coalition. He would be out of power. He would stand a much less chance of evading jail time. So there are all these domino effects. And I just, there's just too many unknowns, and I just don't believe it'll happen. Believe me, and I say this every time, I so want to be wrong on this. And I would love it if next week when we come together, I'm telling you all the great news about how the hostages have been released. You know, another big point of contention is whether Israel should push for a full-on hostage release deal or just do it in parts. You know, maybe women first, and then the elderly, and then the sick, and then the men. More and more Israelis are saying that they want a comprehensive hostage deal once and for all. I agree with that. I don't think there's any time to spare. I think there hasn't been time to spare for a long time. We are way past the point where it's even survivable. You know, at this point, we're really looking at the most 70 living hostages out of the 101 who are still there. The rest are just bodies. It's probably lower than 71. So the idea that we have time for others to keep on being there while a different group gets out, that's just not acceptable and not really possible physiologically, psychologically. So I, like many Israelis, are in favor of a comprehensive deal. But again, I don't have faith that it would actually happen. We've been this close before, and it's always managed to fall apart. I'm sorry I'm pessimistic. I wish I didn't have to say this, but that's my point of view on that. Okay. I'm going to take about 10 seconds to get some air and water up, and then we'll come back with your questions that I've collected. All right. Welcome back. And you know, I do see that there's one comment in the chat about Israel should reoccupy Gaza and resettle there. And I want to tell you that at the beginning of the war, this was a very unpopular point of view among Israelis. I think the feeling was we do not want to be in Gaza any longer than we have to. We don't want our soldiers to be there in harm's way. But I got to say, more and more public opinion in Israel is starting to sway in favor of resettling Gaza, not because suddenly all Israelis are religious and believe in this grander vision of Eretz Yisrael. It's more of a safety thing. It's more of exactly as it said in the comment. Look what happened before when we pulled out of Lebanon in 2000. I talked about this last week in the pod. All that did was create a vacuum where Hezbollah could fill that space, build tunnels, take up arms, and prepare for an attack. We left Gaza in 2005 thinking that, this is what they were complaining about. Now we're going to get out and they can rebuild and have the Palestinian country they want in Gaza. And all they did with the billions and billions of dollars pouring in from the world to build a society was dig a tunnel network and purchase arms from Iran and really set their sights on anything they could do to destroy Israel. So I wouldn't say it's a majority of Israelis who believe in resettling Gaza, but more and more are open to it because they're saying, well, if we don't do that, what's the better solution? So that's another changing opinion happening in Israel right now too. Okay, here's a question from Robert. Robert writes, at some point, Israel needs to change the election process so that officials represent specific communities, like Congress does in the U.S. Has anyone actually proposed this? So what Robert is talking about is that in Israel, the members of Knesset, there are 120 members of Knesset, they do not represent specific parts of Israel. There is no person in Knesset who is looking out for my neighborhood in Ra'anana. There's no one who's looking out for Tel Aviv areas or Arab cities in Israel. You don't even vote for people in Israel. You vote for the party, and then the party is who you're voting for. And so they're looking out for the interests of their party voters around the country, but there was no one actually beholden to neighborhoods or areas of the country like it is in Congress. And has anyone ever proposed changing this? I have never heard of anyone proposing it. I've definitely heard people talking about it being problematic, but I've never heard of actual serious legislation to change the way party officials are elected in Israel. I think that would be against the interests of most people who are running for office in Israel. They prefer this way. They're anonymous. they don't have to answer to questions from their home communities. I think it's a lot easier to sneak by and just vote the party line without being questioned this way. I do think we need to make a lot of changes in Israel. I think we should vote for people and not parties. I think we need to change the way the whole coalition system really favors these small parties who, at the end of the day, end up with way too much power. So there are a number of changes that if I were the king of Israel, if I could make these changes, that I would make. Okay, Michelle, question two. Here's a random question triggered by your military notes, which were in English. Last week in my Lebanon podcast, I shared my actual notes from the basic training lecture that we had before we went to Lebanon. Our officer, our mem, gave us an hour-long lecture on what to expect in Lebanon, and he tried to explain all the warring parties. And so I included this page in my book, Crybaby Brigade, and showed it to you last week. I showed it in my newsletter, I believe. Because it's so chaotic and I couldn't keep track of all the warring parties in Lebanon. It was like a good visual demonstration, and it was in English. And so Michelle is asking, when you're a lone soldier in Israel, are most people in your unit also lone soldiers as well? Is English your primary language in your unit, or do you learn Hebrew first? So the first part of the question is no. When you're a lone soldier, you're typically in a unit of Hebrew-speaking Israelis. There was a time when they had platoons specifically for lone soldiers. I think you would study in yeshiva for 9 months, and then you'd all go into the army for a year and 3 months together, and then you'd come out and do another maybe 6 months in yeshiva in Israel. And it was called Machal, Mitnadvei Chutz La'aretz, volunteers from outside of Israel. As far as I know, that no longer exists. And even if it does, there are no more English-only units. In fact, it's actually against the law for officers and commanders to speak with each other or with their soldiers in a language other than Hebrew, unless the soldier needs it to understand in order. So, for example, I remember being in the army in Lebanon, and the tank commander, our officer, was Russian, and the driver of our tank was Russian. And the tank driver, Pavel, would sometimes talk to our officer in Russian over the radio just to ask a question. And our officer would remind him, no, we have to speak in Hebrew. The law is we need to speak in Hebrew. So there are no units where English is the only one. I happen to have one other English-speaking lone soldier in my platoon. His name is Tim Bailey. He's a featured character in the book, 188th Crybaby Brigade. We spoke in English. He had no Hebrew at all. My Hebrew was fluent at that point. It was very strong from Shechter and Camp Ramah and some time in Israel. Tim had no Hebrew. So they taught him the 6 words you need to know in order to be a tank driver: kadima achora, which means forward back; yamin small, right left; sa atzor, go stop. And with those 6 words, he was an excellent soldier, probably because he just had no idea what else was going on, and so he couldn't question anything. But I would speak English with Tim just after hours. We would bond, but otherwise there are no English-speaking units in the IDF. Okay. Mike wrote in with a question, why can't Israel try Hamas for war crimes, similar to how Israel tried Eichmann and then execute them the way we executed Eichmann? Israel does have the death penalty. It's, I think, a little known fact that Israel does have the death penalty. However, it's only been used once in our history on Adolf Eichmann, the notorious Holocaust Nazi, who was brought to trial in Israel and hung. I think this past week, the executioner who actually hung pulled what's the terminology? The lever, the rope, whatever, and hung Eichmann. I think he passed away this past week. And he always expressed regret that he had to do it. And I think that's very Jewish, that we really don't like the idea of executions, of taking a life. That's why the death penalty is not used in Israel, even though we have it. I think in the Talmud, there's some writings that are very strong about you should not execute a prisoner unless you are absolutely certain. And even then, if there's even a sliver of the doubt, it really is against Jewish law. So this question, though, for Mike is, why can't Israel try Hamas for war crimes? And perhaps put them on trial and execute them. That has been spoken about. I remember very early on in the war, probably December of last year, about a year ago, after the immediate shock had passed, but while we were still in the beginning stages. And we have captured a number of terrorists who took part in the October 7th massacre. There was a lot of talk about what we would do with them. Should we put them on trial? Should we have a trial not just to possibly execute them, but to show the rest of the world what they were doing? That by having them testify in open court, there's video of these Hamas terrorists admitting what they did, admitting to the murders, the rapes, the beheadings. And so the idea is if we could put them on trial, it would show the rest of the world and really make it indisputable what occurred on October 7th. But I got to tell you, that conversation, I haven't heard it in a while. I haven't heard it in, well, like I said, in about a year. It just seems to have dropped off the table. I guess to, speak crassly, we kind of have bigger fish to fry. We have two wars and the war with Iran. We have now Syria falling. Like we're just not, we're not there yet about what to do with all those prisoners. I will say Another big debate was what to do with injured terrorists who were injured on October 7th by us, by IDF soldiers injured in firefights. We hospitalized many of them. And there was a lot of uproar in Israel that why should our tax dollars that are paying for hospitals go to treat not just terrorists, but the worst of the worst, the ones who committed the most horrific crimes on October 7th. And I remember hearing interviews with doctors on the radio in Israel on television saying, there were some doctors who said, as horrific as it is, I took an oath, and a human life is a human life, and I'm going to treat them as if they are a human being, not knowing what their background is. And there were other doctors who literally refused and said that either you transfer me off of this floor or out of this ward or to a different hospital, or I will resign my position. They were so sickened by the idea that their medical knowledge not only would go to treat these terrorists, but that every minute they spend treating a terrorist is another minute they're not spending with someone else. Any money, any medication given to these terrorists, money for their treatment, is money that could go elsewhere, medication that could go elsewhere. So that was another really big debate in Israel. But we don't have an answer yet, Mike. We don't know yet what we're going to do with the terrorists that we are holding. It still is good that we have them because we've been able to get a lot of intelligence from them, and we've made a lot of progress against Hamas, very close to wiping them out in Gaza. And one of the reasons is the intelligence we've gotten from captured prisoners. Okay. Barb asked, I've heard that there are a number of conspiracy theories flying around Israel regarding October 7th. What are some of them? It's an interesting question, and I was debating whether I should answer this because on the one hand, I don't want to be someone who is contributing to conspiracy theories that I don't believe are true. But at the same time, if my mission is to show you what Israelis are talking about, then I sort of owe it to you to tell you the truth, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. And yes, Barb, there is a lot of talk of conspiracy theories in Israel. I wouldn't say it's a high percentage of the population, but there's a significant number, 8%, 10%, who do believe in that there's some conspiracy happening. One of them, at the most extreme, is that Netanyahu and others allowed October 7th to happen because they knew it would keep him in power, and they wanted to punish left-wing progressive settlers of southern Israel. Almost all of those killed on October 7th are of the, kibbutz, moshav background, left-wing, secular, not religious. And so there was a theory that this would bolster the right wing by allowing it to happen. I personally can't agree with that on various levels, but there are people, and what they will do in these WhatsApp groups where they're sharing this, they will list all the different pieces of evidence. Netanyahu got a phone call early in the morning on October 7th, And he said, "Call me back in 10 minutes," allowing, to allow the attack to go on further, supposedly. That all these IDF soldiers were actually showing up. I mean, this is a known thing that IDF soldiers were showing up in the South ready to fight, but they were not allowed to go in to fight. And I think the reason was is no one really understood what was happening. But there are others who are saying that they were held back from fighting so that the slaughter could keep on occurring and allow the attacks to happen. So yeah, these are some of the conspiracy theories that are going around. I know some very smart people who buy them, and I think in general, what I've found is that the people who believe conspiracy theories that often are very intelligent, maybe in a way too intelligent for their own good. They're able to put these puzzles of the pieces of the puzzle together where there actually are no real pieces to put together, but they're able with their intelligence to construct them and build a narrative. So again, I don't subscribe to them. I think egregious mistakes were made. I think there was a lot of hubris and a lot of errors. October 7th, I think we're pretty sure right now could have been avoided, but I would not personally go so far as to say that it's a conspiracy theory. The main reason I don't believe in conspiracy theories in general is that the number of people required to keep a secret, to keep that conspiracy going, you're talking about a very large number of people, and human beings notoriously are horrible secret keepers. We're terrible at keeping secrets, and so I just think it's not really possible that that number could all get on the same page and keep the secret for that long. Okay. Beth asks, do Israelis feel there's a connection between the weekly judicial reform rallies throughout 2023 and the October 7th attacks? So yeah, as to remind you that throughout 2023, Israelis were out on the streets protesting judicial reform measures for 8, 9 months before October 7th happened. So Beth is asking, do Israelis feel there's a connection? Well, yes, Israelis do feel there's a connection on two levels. I think those on the left believe that judicial reform distracted the army, distracted the government, distracted the Shin Bet, security services from Gaza. They had to refocus instead on the West Bank. They had to refocus on keeping the civil peace in the middle of Israeli society, and simply they took their eye off the ball. Now, those on the right would say that these rallies in week after week in Tel Aviv and other places against judicial reform, that these showed our enemies that we were thinking about other issues besides them, and that we were becoming weak and that we were becoming vulnerable to attack. So whatever you believe, I don't think anyone in Israel would say that the 9 months of judicial reform leading up to October 7th, that it was completely disconnected. I think everyone agrees that there's some sort of a connection there, but it really depends on what point of view you have as to how and what you think that connection is. Okay. Joanne writes, you talk a lot about Haredi draft dodging, but I heard that in the past there was 30% draft evasion by secular men. And so what Joanne is talking about is that, yeah, I've mentioned before that one of the big challenges Israel is facing right now is to draft the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi community into the IDF. Last year alone, 66,000 Haredi ultra-Orthodox men who qualified for IDF service were given exemptions in order to serve, not in the army, but in order to study in yeshiva. And meanwhile, the army has been extending the length of service for the conscripts who are 18 to 21 and raising the age of reservists. But Joanne is saying, I've heard in the past that secular men have been evading the draft as well, and there is a significant percentage of draft dodging among secular Israeli men. I don't think it's as high as 30%. I can't give you the exact number, but I know that more than ever, it is easier to get out of the Israeli army if you don't want to. First of all, the army just is becoming more technological, and so we've had to I'm saying up till October 7th, Right now we have a shortage of 10,000 soldiers. So maybe it's not good that so many were able to get out of it. But until October 7th, it was, I wouldn't say relatively easy, but let's just say if you fought enough, you could get out of service in the IDF. One very common way to do it is just say that if you put me in the army, I'll shoot myself. And, really, no, the medical, the psychological staff in the IDF doesn't want to deal with those kind of cases. Um, but there are certainly ways to get out of it if you really don't want to serve. I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes harder now that we're so short on soldiers. But in answer to the question, yes, secular drafted evasion has happened in the past as well. Okay. Last question is from Ruth. Before I read it, take a sip here. So Ruth asks, she said, I heard Leket Israel donates food to soldiers. Does anyone know how I can participate either as a volunteer or donate money? Yeah, Leket is a great organization. They're actually based in Ra'anana, about a mile away from my house. I've gone there to volunteer. So you can go there and show up and volunteer. I mean, I think you arrange it ahead of time. You would go to Leket. I think it's leket.us, if I'm not mistaken. But if you Google Leket Israel Food Bank, Leket, their website will come up, and you can go there as a volunteer. They will help you if you want to go to the south and pick vegetables and fruits. They were doing that for a while. I'm sure it's still needed, and you can always just make a donation. Leket is really they're really trying to bring to the forefront the idea of food insecurity in Israel. Not even related to October 7th, but for years and years before. I have actually performed comedy at a fundraiser for Leket, and they have a special place in my heart for them, just because I know their staff and I know that they've done such good work. So if you're looking where to put your money, Leket is a great place. And sadly, there is a lot of food insecurity in Israel. I believe that it might be a quarter or even a third of Israeli children live below the poverty line in Israel. We hear all about startup nation and wealthy Israelis who make exits, but there are far many more Israelis who don't have the means to even finish the month and put food on the table the way they should, healthily and with the right nutrition. So, giving to something like Leket Israel, it's probably not as sexy as donating to buy, combat vests or combat scopes for soldiers or building a park and putting your name on it, but food is food, and it is one of the most important resources in Israel that sadly not enough people have. Okay, that's it for this episode of Inside Israel. Thanks for joining us. Next week, our live broadcast is back to Sunday. So it's going to be Sunday night, December 22nd at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Of course, the email will go out on Thursday, Inside Israel, with the time and the link. And if you need that, if you're not signed up for my newsletter, I put the website right there in the chat, joelchasnoff.com/podcasts. I love hearing your questions. So go ahead, send your questions into me. I'm also posting more and more clips from interviews. So like I interviewed Yossi Klein Halevi, I had interviewed Amanda Borschelt-Dan. I'm posting clips from those interviews on my Instagram page. I don't know how many of you are on Instagram, but if you are, it's just at Joel Chasnoff is the handle. I put that in the chat right now as well. And there's comedy clips there too. So looking forward to seeing you next week, the 22nd of December at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're coming out to Christmas Eve for the Jews at citywinery.com, like I said, 20 tickets left, so you better get a move on that. Email your questions to me, and I will see you next Sunday. Signing off. Lehitraot. Until next time, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll leave the chat open a couple more minutes.